So today's KH Talk is going to be a lot more informational than anything else. It's not going to be a reflection of like an audience or anything like that. It's not going to be like last time where we talked a lot about just how people perceive like criticism and then like delve into a lot of stuff like situation commands and all that other stuff. But it is something that I thought would be just interesting to talk about, because I don't see a lot of people talking about it all that much outside of just face value analysis. That topic of discussion is KH2's final mix update was groundbreaking. And I mean, you might read this title and you might just think like, well, yeah, no fucking shit, dude. KH2FM was fucking good. And I'm like, yeah, I 100% agree with you. You're totally right. The reason that I worded it like this is that the transition from KH2 to KH2FM was what was groundbreaking. That's what I want to analyze in this KH Talk. Because whenever people talk about KH2 nowadays, like when you say Kingdom Hearts 2, you aren't even just talking about Kingdom Hearts 2 English anymore. Like most of the time, you're just referring to the final mix version, because the final mix version is just the better version. It is the definitive final version of KH2 that most people refer to whenever they want to talk about like what KH2 did well, or, you know, whatever the heck. To analyze why 2FM was so groundbreaking in comparison to base KH2, we kind of have to talk about what base KH2 was like. A lot of people just think of KH2 as 2FM, and I feel like a lot of people don't even remember what base KH2 was like. So let's talk about that a little bit. What's important to talk about first is, there's going to be a lot of like downfalls to talk about later, but probably the biggest thing to mention is that base KH2 still retained the fluid and easy to use combo system. And you might look at this and think like, well, yeah, no fucking shit, dude. It's just, like who gives a shit about that? Like, who gives a shit about the fact that it retained that? But like a lot of these like very small fundamental building blocks that KH2 developed that weren't available in KH1 are so hugely important to why KH2's combat system works as well as it does. Spell integration is just as basic as if I, hit, spell, hit, that last hit is going to be a finisher if it's a 3-hit combo, because spells just naturally blend into the combat system. So you can do like a hit, fire, and then a finisher immediately afterwards. So when I say auto tracking, I'm specifically talking about stuff like as you're going through the combo, auto combos will glue you to the character that you're comboing in order to make sure that all of the hits connect. That goes hand in hand with the next point, which is context-sensitive combo modifiers. Context-sensitive meaning that when you're like really far away from an enemy and you hit the X button to attack, what are you going to do? You're going to use sliding dash, right? Because in that context, when you're far away from an enemy, that's when the game is programmed to be like, oh, if sliding dash is on, it'll activate. It made comboing any enemy, like enemies that are like nearby, bosses, whatever, like it just made it very, very natural for you to just like press the X button and it would just do an automatic combo for you based on the abilities that you have equipped up to that point. Oh yeah, very naturally cancelable. So when I say very naturally cancelable, I mean like you can use a finisher and then do a drive explosion and it'll just cancel the lag frames of your finisher. You don't have to like do the entirety of the finisher in order to activate a drive. Or you can, you'll be in the middle of a combo and you'll be like, hey, I want to like, at this particular point in the combo, I want to use a limit. Like I want to use Duck Flare right now at this moment. And the game is just cool with that. It's just like, you want to cancel shit? Like, dude, we got that shit for you. Drive, limit, summons, whatever you want, dude. Like we got that. Just like the fundamental groundbreaking aspects of base KH2 were like in place before KH2FM was a thing. Most of your tools still had lots of utility. Utility was just very present within KH2 from the get-go, right? You want to talk about spells. Fire is AoE. Blizzard is more of just like a straight shot shotgun sort of thing. Thunder covers both of those options, but at the cost of higher MP usage. Naturally, Reflect and Magnet just are oozing with utility. Reflect itself, it's almost more of a part of Sora's kit than it is like an individual spell. Reflect is just another defensive tool that gives Sora access to iframes. Magnet is just like the ultimate crowd control spell, but at the cost of a huge chunk of MP. Summons are full of utility as well. Like it's crazy. Chicken Little has the automatic suction effect with its whistle. Stitch is able to parry enemies while also just giving you a lot of MP if you're planning on using a lot of spells at any given moment. He'll just refill your MP immediately. Genie lets you switch between multiple different drive forms that he has, and each of them have different attacks for different situations. Like the Valor Punch is good for like a single target, and the Master Form thing is useful for multiple targets if you want to use either one. Peter Pan just has a built-in stun effect, so if you want to do like extended stun locks and you want to get MP orbs, then Peter Pan is really useful for that too. So all of the summons had lots and lots of different utility and were good for different situations. Drives, I mean, God, how many times have I talked about the utility that drives have? Wisdom is just really good for spells. Master Form is really good for aerial targets. Final Form is the all-rounder, but it uses the most amount of drive. Drives themselves still just had a lot of utility in that regard. And then certain limits also had lots of utility. The ability to use them and still combo enemies at the same time just allowed for this extreme amount of flexibility when it came to using limits. And then a solid resource system with drive gauge and MP bar allowed the use of all of Sora's tools at will. A really solid resource system to draw on for each of these things, like drives and summons both call from the drive gauge, spells and limits call from the MP bar, and there's even the added strategy of using the MP bar really efficiently. So for example, when it came to using limits and cure, it would cost the entire MP bar. But if you used certain spells up to that point and you had just a sliver left of the MP bar, you could still use a limit and you could still use a cure. So if you wanted to get the most out of your MP bar, you would use a bunch of spells leading up to the very end of your MP bar before it goes into recharge, and then you would pop a limit to get the most out of that single MP bar. But of course, base KH2 definitely came with its fair share of issues. And when it came out, people very quickly were like, hey, you know, there are some problems with this. Limits were OP as shit in KH2. It was fucking ridiculous. Solo Trinity was so goddamn strong. All of Donald and Goofy's limits were so fucking goddamn, like Duck Flare was ridiculous in KH2. So was Comet. Knock Smash. Y'all want to talk about Knock Smash, dude? Press Knock Smash to win. It was so goddamn strong, dude. Holy shit, man. The big point here is that because these limits they chunked health bars so quickly and so easily, limits were just strong enough to overshadow the utility of Sora's other tools. So like all the other things that I was mentioning before, how summons have a lot of utility, how certain drives would have a lot of utility, how spells would have a lot of utility, all of those things were just very quickly overshadowed by the fact that limits just chunked damage so quickly. Optimal play in KH2 was use a lot of limits and refill that MP bar as quickly as possible to just use more limits, use more crazy damage dealing stuff. Didn't provide much of a challenge. So like beginner mode through proud mode was still really easy. And the big reason for that is because Sora's mash X combos were so extremely effective. And on top of that, bosses just didn't do enough to discourage that sort of play style. The majority of bosses just they would let you just wail on them. If you were persistent enough and just kept on mashing X enough, you would eventually get the W. They didn't reduce your health enough. They didn't like push you away enough. The only bosses that really did that were the problem bosses, which were bosses like Dimix and Zaldin and Zigbar and other shit like that, where they just didn't take your shit. They were just like, okay, well, I'm just going to hit you a bunch if you keep doing this. They were the only ones that were they were very effectively like, hey, you got to stop this. You got to stop this Mash X nonsense. And even then, like if you had enough defense or enough health, or you used any form of iframes whatsoever, you could probably still get past those bosses with enough like just brute force effort. The majority of bosses in the game are just pinatas, where you hit them a bunch and then you hit triangle a bunch to do even more damage or create a stun state. And then you hit them even more, and then you just you cycle through that process over and over again. Extremely limited post-game. There's like one super boss, and it's Sephiroth, and that's it. And just very few bosses in general to fully utilize the extent of the combo system. Like there weren't enough good challenges for you to be like, oh man, I really got to figure out how this combo system works, or how to reflect certain stuff, or how to guard. No, the Hades Cups were definitely post-game, but it's not like they did a very good job of testing out the combo system. And the majority of bosses in Hades Cups, like Leon, Yuffie, Tifa, Cloud, weren't very good tests of the combo system. They were pretty shitty bosses. And yeah, there was just very little to do in general. Unless you were maxing out the Jiminy's Journal, there was just not much to do. There was like some mini games here and there and a lot of synthesis to do and other shit. But as far as like the actual just combat system was concerned, there wasn't much to try it out with. And then of course, the last point, KH2 just had very subpar world design. Even though Sora had a lot of growth abilities to use in KH2, there just wasn't anything to fully utilize them. The majority of areas were just barren wastelands where it wasn't very engaging, wasn't very interesting to traverse these areas. They were just kind of like, you just go from point A to point B and just finish the world as easily as possible. That was base KH2. I would say it was pretty fun. It was just it was a very basic, bare bones action RPG that definitely had a lot of problems, but it was still fun to play. And then we got KH2FM. And our minds were fucking blown. When it comes to 2FM, almost all of the changes made with 2FM, they were either in response to issues in KH2, or they just enhanced what was already awesome. There's new additions, just like stuff that they just added on top of the game. Critical mode. Dude, I could probably make a KH talk just about critical mode and why it was so good. The short version of it is that critical mode made it really, really easy to die. You took the same amount of damage as proud mode. They cut your health in half. You gained XP at a slower rate. 75% of what you normally would get on standard and proud is the experience that you got. But the damage modifier made it so that you did more damage than standard or proud. And on top of that, you got 50 AP to start with, and you got some kick-ass abilities. So while critical mode is supposed to be like this really challenging difficulty, it also just added a lot of quality of life options on top of it, where it's like, hey, let's give you, higher damage. Let's give you some cool abilities to start with. Like the majority of difficulty modes, even like from other games, including Kingdom Hearts around the year 2006, we're just like, okay, so we're going to make this game harder by just making it so you do piss poor damage, and then everything is going to kill you in 2 hits. And it was really artificial. The majority of the time you just resort to camping, and the pace of battle was just really, really slow on a lot of these higher difficulties. But critical mode kept the pace of battles fresh and engaging. It didn't feel like fights were going to take like 15 minutes. It still felt like fights were going to be really, really quick. You would just get killed really easily. It created a system that was just like, hey, just don't get hit, find the openings, deal damage, and you will do really, really well. That's almost like an exact response to the whole like didn't provide much of a challenge. Because these bosses that didn't discourage you nearly enough are actually starting to punch you in the face and like hurt you, encourages players to be like, okay, so like I'm dying a lot. This sucks. So how does this guard thing work? Like, how does this reflect thing work? How do my drive forms work? You start looking to a lot more of your tools in order to solve these problems that you're being confronted with. Limit Form was just a really awesome addition to 2FM. First of all, stylistically, Limit Form is just super cool. I love like the KH1 style KH2 outfit, and like Zantetsuken, Ripple Drive, all of the limits being added into the KH2 system as flawlessly as they were was unbelievable. And it was just a really awesome, useful tool to have that fit into Sora's kit really well. 20, count them, 20 new bosses. Folks, if I told you in the year 2007 that I was going to remake your game, your action game, but I was going to give you 20 new bosses, I would freak out, because that is an exorbitant amount of new bosses to to fight. Like, that's unbelievable. And this, again, it's in direct response to extremely limited post game, where there just weren't very many fights or bosses to test out your combo system with. Now all of a sudden you've got a huge post game, and you've got so many bosses to test out your combo system with. It, like, and all of these guys are humanoid, like, and it just makes the most sense with the combo system that you're working with in 2FM. It was awesome. Imagine you get a DLC for Dark Souls, and instead of getting like 5 new you get 20 new bosses. Are you freaking kidding me? That is unfreaking believable. Speaking of unprecedented new content in 2FM, Cavern of Remembrance, hello? Post-game area that makes the most out of your growth abilities and actually implements some sort of platforming. And not to mention, it's just a cool area to explore in the first place. Like, the core is just awesome. It's got a fantastic normal track and a battle track. Like, Deep Anxiety is one of my favorite tracks in all of video games. It's amazing. And the puzzles are also in direct response to the complaint about, like, growth abilities didn't really have much use in KH2 English, because puzzle pieces were placed in areas that are just barely out of reach. And in order to get that stuff, you gotta level up high jump. You gotta get aerial dodge. You gotta get glide in a bunch of these areas. Both Cavern of Remembrance and the puzzles and the puzzle pieces were in direct response to this very subpar world design issue with the game. And I'm not gonna say like it fixed it, because clearly KH2 still has that issue where the world design is just really, really lacking. The fact that they were just like, you know what? These growth abilities, it feels really shitty that they don't have anything to do. Let's just have them do something in areas like this, or just like have these cool little mini rewards for getting all the puzzle pieces and finishing all the puzzles to become one. Dude, I love that they just give you a Keyblade right as you have the ability to get Final Form, and they're just like, hey, just get Final Form right now by continuously going into drive forms using this Keyblade, instead of like using drives over and over and over and over again like you had to do in KH2 English in order to just hope and pray that eventually on like the 14th millionth try you would get Final Form. Mushroom 13. They basically took the unique Heartless idea from Kingdom Hearts 1 Final Mix, and they threw it into 2FM. I think it was really cool, just having these cool little mini games to make use out of certain tools in the game. And you get a cool little proof out of it, or you get a cute little crown for doing all these mini games. I mean, it's kind of a lackluster Keyblade, but just like cool extra post-game mini games. Once again, it's just like, hey, we're going to give you more freaking content. And this is it. This is exactly it. New combo modifiers, in addition to the context sensitive stuff that we have with, sliding dash, dodge slash, slap shot, just like, the very bare bones stuff that we had in KH2. Let's have this thing called Flash Step, where it's a mini gap closer and it's really satisfying when it hits. Let's add Round Break, so where it's really satisfying to hit when there's multiple enemies surrounding you. Let's add Magnet Splash, so it's this cool little AoE finisher that you can do with your air combos, because we only added one aerial finisher. Let's just fucking add another one. Let's add Aerial Dive, which is just aerial sweep but better, dude. It's just got insanely awesome tracking. Even though the combos in base KH2 were, just naturally really satisfying and fun to use, 2FM was just like, dude, let's just make it even better. Like, why not? Let's just make even better combos. System changes. So on top of the new additions, they just did a lot of system changes. Limits got nerfed hard, and little things like Chicken Little got a small buff. So all of the huge issue with Knock Smash being way too good, with Duck Flare and Comet Solo Trinity being way too good, those things got nerfed super hard. And because you do that, you encourage the use of other things like drives, summons. You encourage the use of options that play toward the good parts of KH2, the awesome combo system, the awesome amount of utility in the game. By nerfing the shit out of the way too good limits in the game, you encourage more utility. That utility was just kind of sitting there waiting to be used. It was just overshadowed completely by the awesome limits that were in vanilla KH2. And then Duck Flare got rebuffed in the PS3 and PS4 version, which is a bug, which should not be there. And yes, Duck Flare is still way too good in 2FM PS4. Yes, I know. It should not be there. It is a bug. It's not even there in the Japanese version of the PS3 and PS4 version. I don't know why it's there. It's stupid. Charging Drive got a huge buff. So yeah, in KH2 English, Charging Drive was really slow. Really, really slow. Even if you use the implemented mechanic where if you were an MP charge, it would recharge faster, it was still way too slow. So the devs just decided, let's just make this faster. Like, let's just make it so that Drive just recharges at a nice, quick rate when you hit a lot of enemies, and that will encourage the continued use of drives and summons and all that other, like, you get to test it out even more and try it out even more. They buffed drive recoveries. Instead of recovering drive 1 gauge at a time, it recovered 3 at a time with a normal one. And then high drives, instead of recovering 3 at a time, would always recover the entire max drive gauge, which could go all the way up to 9. So that's a huge buff to the usage of drive, or things that rely on the drive gauge. Reorganized combo modifier locations. So, like, very naturally, explosion was given to you way early in KH2 English. You just had to finish Agrabah 1. And the same thing with stuff like Counter Guard. Counter Guard you got for beating Olympus Coliseum 2. Like, man, you're really not going to get a lot of usage out of Counter Guard if you're going to get it way too late. So by placing, reorganizing where the combo modifiers show up, they just get a lot more usage. Finishing Leap is actually just placed in a location early on instead of Explosion that encourages the use of, like, what would honestly be just a good finisher for that point in the game. And then you get Explosion way later on when it makes sense to get a really strong finisher. There's a ton of other system changes in 2FM that, like, for example, Reflect being buffed as much as it was probably shouldn't have happened, but it at least encouraged the continued use of Reflect. So that was honestly pretty cool. Last point. Why is KH2FM loved so much, right? I think this is like a fair question that people would ask. Like, why is 2FM loved so much in comparison to, like, other final mixes in the series, right? Why do people talk about 2FM specifically over, like, one final mix? And, like, one final mix was good, but, like, 2FM is, like, the big dude. Like, that's the one that people really talk about. Birth by Sleep final mix, right? Like, people don't really talk about that one that much. Remind is super dope. Even in comparison to 2FM, Remind kind of pales a little bit because 2FM just had that ridiculous content dump. Like, it was absurd the amount of content that you got in 2FM. The reasons why 2FM was so lauded by fans is that the fundamental aspects of KH2 were extremely solid. All 2FM had to do in order to build on top of what was already fundamentally so great was to fix the things that weren't very good. So the lack of post-game content, the fact that limits overshadowed that utility, so you needed to nerf those in order to make other options way more useful. Stuff like Cavern of Remembrance and the puzzles, at the very least encouraging the usage of growth abilities and making worlds feel a little bit more memorable. And then on top of that, you just take what was already good and make it even better, right? And so when it comes to other Final Mix versions or other, Remind versions, it's not to say that those versions were bad, all right? Let me preface that. I'm not here to say that Remind is super bad. I am not here to shit on Birth by Sleep Final Mix. I'm not here to shit on One Final Mix. I'm not here to do that. But the reason that they didn't do it nearly as well as 2FM is either, number one, they weren't blessed with that solid fundamental base that 2FM had, that I just mentioned earlier. Birth by Sleep Final Mix added a bunch of different bosses, they added new keyblades, they added a lot of new stuff, but it wasn't nearly as solid because the fundamental base of Birth by Sleep was just flawed from the get-go. So while those bosses might be cool in a different game, they aren't as solid in Birth by Sleep. Bosses like No Heart, bosses like Armor of the Master, like stuff like that, it's just, they never get stunned. You can't really do any combos with them. It's a lot of Thunder Surge spam. It's a lot of this, it's a lot of that. It made it very, very difficult to work with. Even when it comes to stuff like Remind, right? Remind added a shit ton of bosses, and new content and new forms and new combo modifiers, and all of those things were fucking incredible. It rose KH3 from like this somewhat middling game to like a pretty damn solid game with really cool endgame content. But the problem is that with KH3's base system, with stuff like team attacks, with stuff like attraction flow, brand magic, with a lot of this stuff just feeling luck dependent, with Sora just being very handicapped because he had to rely on the situation command system to get a lot of, his fundamental tools, it felt like you lacked a lot of utility. It felt like you lacked a lot of variety when it came to bosses in KH3 Remind. The other reason why other Final Mixes and Remind versions would pale in comparison is because the content that was added wasn't nearly as substantial in comparison to the ridiculous glow up that 2FM got. One Final Mix got, in comparison to one English, the extra boss that you got was unknown. It still added a lot of other cool stuff, like it added some new keyblades, it added some new pieces of armor, it added some new abilities here and there, and it added new Heartless to fight in certain areas. The content just wasn't nearly as substantial as the glow up that 2FM got, which was absolutely absurd. And it was the same with Birth by Sleep Final Mix too, right? It was a few bosses, No Heart, Armor of the Master. For the J crowd, they finally got Mysterious Figure, and they got, you got like a new command style here, maybe a new Keyblade here, and maybe some new commands here or there, and you got like a secret episode on top of that as well. But if you compare all of that content to all the stuff that you got in 2FM, it's like, dude, holy fucking shit. 2FM added so much to that game. Like, they had like, what, a year, less than a year, and they were already like ready, like, hey, we're gonna throw in 20 new bosses, new keyblades, new area, Cavern of Remembrance. We're gonna add in these new mini games with the Mushroom 13. We're gonna add this, we're gonna add that. We're gonna like, it's just so much new content, dude. So much new content. So when people talk about why they love 2FM so much, it's not necessarily at the expense of other games. It's not like Birth by Sleep Final Mix is just this awful, shitty game, or KH3 Remind is just this awful, shitty game, or anything like that. It's just because the glow up that 2FM got was just that good. Remind gave KH3 a glow up for sure. It wasn't as crazy or as substantial as the shit in 2FM. I have to imagine that most of 2FM's added stuff was cut from original KH2 and just finished in that extra time. I think that you're absolutely right. I think that they were probably already thinking, oh yeah, we're already making limit form, but it's just not ready yet. So we're just going to throw that in Final Mix. Or like, we're thinking about adding this, combo modifier, or we're thinking about adding this thing or that thing into the game, but it's just not ready yet. So we're going to wait. Base KH2 will come out and we'll finish all this stuff here. And then when we get to 2FM, we're just going to dump out all the content. But even then, like even then, when you think about the vast gap between KH2 and 2FM, it's ridiculous the amount of content that 2FM got. But yeah, that's pretty much it.